is Barbara Honegger. Barbara is a member of the Board of Directors, investigative researcher, and officer of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. She has served in high-level positions in the United States government, including Special Assistant to the President, White House Policy Analyst, and Director of the Attorney General's Law Review at the Department of Justice. From 1995 to 2011, Barbara served as Senior Military Affairs Journalist at the Naval Postgraduate School, the premier science, technology, and national security affairs graduate research university of the Department of Defense. Her pioneering book, October Surprise, on the deep story behind the Iran side of the Iran-Contra scandal, now confirmed by formerly classified documents and deathbed confessions of conspirators, led to full subpoena power congressional reinvestigation of Iran-gate, funded at the level of a 9/11 commission. From the day of 9/11, Ms. Honegger has been a leading researcher, journalist, author, documentarian, and public speaker on the events of that day and the 9/11 linked anthrax attacks, giving presentations at conferences and speaking tours in the United States, Europe, and Canada. She earned a BA degree from Stanford University, a Master of Science degree from John F. Kennedy University, and a master's level certification in national security decision-making from the Naval War College. She's run twice from Congress from California, Central Coast District. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would give a warm welcome to Barbara Honegger.
Can you hear me?
Oh, can't hear.
Cannot? Can you hear me?
I hear you, Barbara.
Yeah, can they hear me?
She needs to unmute.
I
You
am.
need to unmute.
Plug that in, it went away.
I'm unmuted.
Not now. We can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me now. Okay, thanks, Shauna. Yeah, I was unmuted all along. I don't know what that was. Okay, you can hear me, right?
Yeah, this one.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we
Okay.
can hear you.
Okay, very good. I'm going to be on the screen for a short period of time here at the beginning. Hi, Shauna. For a short period of time, and then we're going to go to my slides. So for the vast majority of this presentation, the slides will be on the screen. And then at the end, I hope to be able to come on again. I'd just like to begin by saying thank you so much to Judith, to Dawn, to Randy, to Peter, and to everyone who's putting on this incredibly important event. It's an honor to be speaking here, especially after Bar McClellan and Gordon Ferry. My God, I feel like I'm out of my league, but I'm going to be doing my very best to bring you what I consider to be the most important big picture that you can have. I want to have a disclaimer here. I am not a JFK expert. I am an honest researcher who is an expert on 9/11, and I have studied the JFK assassination. So my mission from Judith and Dawn and everybody is to bring you the parallels between the two and what they can tell us about who's really behind both of them, the category of people at the top who are behind both of them. So Peter, if you could bring up the first slide of the presentation, and it should take up the whole screen.
It'll take a couple seconds. We're on it.
Yeah. Okay, so it's 9:20 and I have 55 minutes. So if I calculate correctly, that means, does it not, that I will have until 10:15 California time, 12:15, and then we'll go to Q's and A's. I need the full 55 minutes. Okay, I think we see my first slide on the screen. All right, I'm going to be going through these slides very quickly. I'm going to say next slide, please, because Peter is forwarding my slides remotely. I've titled my presentation From JFK Assassination to 9/11 Mass Assassination. And there, as you will see, there is a reason for that. All right, if we could have the next slide, please. All right. I'm going to go through these very quickly because I want to give you a big overview. I'm not going to read everything on every slide. There wouldn't be enough time, but it's very important for people to be able to see my slides. So all you need to do is email me at bshonegg@gmail.com. I'll repeat that in a second. And in the subject line, say JFK slide request, and I will send you my entire PowerPoint slides, which you are going to want to study. All right. So again, that email is B as in boy, S as in Sam, HONEGG@gmail.com. So please do ask for my slides. All right. So this first slide, I want to make the major point that it's definitely the assassination of John F. Kennedy, of RFK, of MLK. These are routine. This is the way the international deep state does business. For instance, they kill presidents, queens, princesses, prime ministers, UN secretary generals, senators, and as you will see on 9/11, they kill us, don't they? There was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was poisoned, President John F. Kennedy, multiple shooters, President Salvador Allende of Chile, plane crash assassination, President Ronald Reagan assassination attempt, multiple shooters. I was there that day. You should probably have me back to talk about what it was like in the White House on the day of the Reagan assassination attempt. President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, multiple shooters, President Olof Palme of Sweden, shooter, Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, suicide blast, killer, Queen Grace Kelly, automobile assassination, Princess Diana, automobile assassination, UN General Secretary Hammarskjöld, plane crash assassination, John Tower, Senator, plane crash assassination, Senator Paul Wellstone was getting too close to wanting a 9/11 new investigation, plane crash assassination, John F. Kennedy Jr., plane crash assassination, Gladio operations, mass assassinations of civilians in the Cold War in Europe, and then the 9/11 mass assassination of civilians via plane crashes and fires. Senators Leahy and Daschle in the United States Senate. There was an assassination attempt with a weapon of mass destruction, the highest weaponized military grade anthrax that had ever been seen by the US government, in letters to them in the Senate right after 9/11. And I could go on, but I think you get my point. So let's go to the next slide. Peter, if we could go to the next slide. All right, now this is a, Peter, you're going to need to move the arrow over the screen and then move the arrow onto the screen, Put the arrow on the screen within the slide. Move it
It's
over.
also-
Yes. Now you can see the arrow at the bottom. Click on that and see if we can start. Good. So,
On September 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. At first light on that morning, troops and tanks advancing on our
Peter, you can
presidential
stop it.
palace.
You can stop the. All right, so what you just saw, it goes on when you get my PowerPoint slides. You can see the whole approximate 45 seconds of this video clip, but many people don't know that on September 11th, 1973, President Salvador Allende was assassinated by a plane crash into his presidential palace. That was on September 11th, 1973, and something very similar happened on, of course, September 11th, 2001. All right, could we have the next slide, please? I'm glad that the video clips are working because I have 3 more that are very important. All right, I'd just like to give a big picture here. I should say that I am honored to have met and interacted at length over the phone and in person with Gordon Ferry. And what he has informed me in my own reading and research, and having been in the federal government and in the working for the Pentagon as a senior journalist for the Department of Defense for a decade and a half. This is my big picture take. I think that it's a misnomer to talk about the deep state. I believe that the deep state really is simply part of the state, part of the United States government. It's the secret part, and secrecy breeds ultimate corruption. The state itself, and especially the deep state, the secret state within it, the highly classified state, is a giant protection racket founded on maintaining a monopoly on violence. In fact, if you study political science, you will learn that a state is based upon having a monopoly on violence. And as you will see in this presentation, our deep state, in fact, our state itself, considers all citizens to be expendable, not just our military personnel. And of course, they have to do that to keep the fear going, to keep the protection money racket, which is taxes, flowing. The balance of power is really a balance of terror. And as you will see in this presentation, it's all about the weapons, in particular, the most deadly weapons, including weapons capable of taking out all life. And I'm not just talking about human life, but all life on the surface of the planet and the upper part of the ocean, especially with nuclear and biological weapons. Can we take the next slide, please? All right. So obviously, the JFK assassination and 9/11, I'm sure that this audience already knows that they, of course, are conspiracies. The only question, of course, is what or which conspiracy is true? What are the real facts? And I would highly recommend this book, Conspiracy in America, by Professor Lance DeHaven Smith. And he focuses in, of course, on the famous 1967 CIA conspiracy theory memo, which they had to come up with in order to try to discredit people like us who are trying to get to the truth when the JFK assassination truth movement was getting too close to the truth. May I have the next slide, please? All right, so as you're going to see in this presentation, I'm going to marshal the evidence for you. Both the JFK assassination, as you already know, but also 9/11 are false flag conspiracies. That's a special kind of conspiracy that is staged to cast false blame on an enemy or a rival to justify war or the perpetuation of war. In the case of JFK, the Cold War, and of course, the Vietnam War. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, so the next series of slides and evidence that I'm going to give you is to prove to you the 5 top signatures of a false flag and how they apply to both the JFK assassination and the September 11th attacks. Both the preparation for it, for the carrying out of the acts, of the high crimes, and also the cover-up afterwards, of course, which is critical. Okay, so the first we're going to see the 5 signatures, top signatures of a false flag. The first one is horrific images to sear into the collective mind. And we're going to see how important that is. May I have the next slide, please? All right, so I asked myself the question when I started researching the JFK conference and being invited by Judas to these wonderful conferences. I think this is my 4th one, might even be my 5th, but I think it's the 4th. I asked myself a question that I didn't hear anyone else asking. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I think it's a critical question. Why did JFK obviously have to be killed so publicly and so violently on live television? I think that's a very important question. And I think that it leads to the question, who or what had to be convinced that he was truly, really, absolutely, totally dead? I think that's a very important question, and we need to answer it. Like JFK, as you will see, and as you know, the Twin Towers in the World Trade Center, the attacks on those towers were timed exquisitely so that by the time the second attack happened on World Trade Center 2, that every single camera and video camera and cell phone camera in the world would be trained on the Twin Towers, because the first tower, World Trade Center 1, that was attacked 16 minutes before, was already smoking. All right, so in both cases, in both the assassination on live television with JFK and the mass assassination of innocent civilians in the Twin Towers, and to a lesser extent the Pentagon on 9/11, the mainstream media, at the behest of the government, deep state, of course, that controls the top levels of the mainstream media through the editors and the managers, there was this ad nauseum repetition of the most traumatic video clips. Now, this is designed to induce a collective post-traumatic stress syndrome trauma, which is necessary for the deep state to traumatize the public into being willing to accept extreme measures after the fact. So we saw President Kennedy's head exploding ad nauseum on television, and we saw the Twin Towers exploding and then collapsing in seconds, such that the mainstream media would ad nauseum show you the Twin Towers exploding and then leave out the 45 minutes or so in between and immediately show you the collapsing of the towers, so that your brain would assume that the collapse of the towers was because of the plane impacts, which of course has been proven to be completely and totally physically impossible and false. So what this does is it gets the mass audience that watches live on TV or watches the video afterwards to identify, in the case of JFK, with the victim, to identify with the president, and in the case of 9/11, to identify with the plane passengers and the victims in the towers. All right, could I have the next slide, please? Now, these, of course, are examples of these images, video clips that were shown ad nauseum, ad nauseum, ad nauseum on television for this very reason. May I have the next slide, please? So I would just like to say, I highly recommend, of course, there are many books on the JFK assassination, thousands, I'm sure. I have read maybe 25 of them. This is one that is a must. If in a little bit later in this presentation, you will see a clip of Cyril Wecht, by the way, from a brand new 9/11 Truth Movement documentary called The Unspeakable as well, but we'll get to that later. So the point I'm making here and what I've just said leading up to this point is that after 9/11, for the reasons I just gave, we are all JFK now. They are trying to get us all to identify with the victims. All right, may I have the next slide, please, Peter? All right, so remember I talked about that the whole purpose of these operations is the mass trauma. And these mass trauma events are called searing events by none other than the expert in the world on it, none other than Philip Zelikow, who of course was and for that very reason, he was made executive director of the 9/11 Commission, who specializes in the establishment and maintenance of collective public myths that are based upon such searing public video images. All right, so if I could have the next slide, please. Now we're going to go into the evidence that both the JFK assassination and 9/11 are false flags. If I may have the next slide, please. This slide is about the definition of a false flag. It's actually evolved over time. The general main definition is that it is an act committed almost always by covert operatives, undercover agents, commandos of a state, but they can also be by non-state actors like the mafia, but with the intent of disguising the real perpetrator, the actual source of the responsibility for the act, and pinning the blame on another party, normally as a pretext to invade another country. The term false flag includes countries that organize an attack also critically on themselves, and then make the attack appear to be by an enemy nation or terrorist to give the nation that was supposedly attacked the pretext for military aggression and domestic repression at home. That actually happened with Hitler for the beginning of World War II. He had his soldiers dress up as so-called enemy troops, attacked them himself, and then blamed it on the other party and invaded, I believe that was Czechoslovakia. All right, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so just to give you an idea of how false flags are the way that the state, not just the deep state, but the way that the United States government, military and intelligence complex has been operating ever since the beginning. And in fact, before that, King George, many people don't know, had his own ship destroyed and tried to blame it on the American colonists. I learned that just recently in preparing for this presentation. So just very quickly, the history of false flags by the US government, of which the JFK assassination, of course, attempting by one of the groups of perpetrators had hoped to blame it on Cuba. But they decided not to do that because it was too dangerous. They might trigger a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So that didn't happen. They covered up their own cover up. But going into what the United States government has done as routine to get us into wars. The Mexican War in 1846, President Polk invaded Mexico and then blamed the Mexicans to start the war. Spanish-American War, same thing. World War II, the sinking of the Lusitania, the Zimmerman telegram got the US into the war. World War II, of course, Pearl Harbor, many people know, many people don't, but many people do know now that, especially because of the book Day of Infamy and many others, but that's the most important one, you must read it, that the attack on Pearl Harbor was orchestrated in the sense that FDR and the deep state operators had broken the Japanese code, and we goaded Japan into attacking Pearl Harbor because we needed the attack on Pearl Harbor in order to galvanize this so-called searing event of seeing the smoke cloud coming up from the USS Arizona and other ships. The whole thing was known in advance and facilitated to happen by our own government with the help, of course, of Churchill and his minions. Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, obviously everyone knows that. Gulf War I, there was the lies by the Kuwaiti, the daughter of the Kuwaiti, I believe it was UN ambassador, that there were to Congress, that the Iraqis were baby killers and throwing babies out of bathinets to get the public galvanized to support the first Gulf War under President George Bush Sr. And in 9/11, very important, a plane taken over by hijackers from another country, or at least with another national identity, can be a false flag, can be considered a false flag if they are being set up to take the blame by higher level inside perpetrators, which is the case in 9/11. Okay, if I can have the next slide, please. All right, so these leading up to 9/11, and we will get back to the parallels with JFK, leading up to 9/11, there had to be a setup, and then after 9/11, a maintenance of the false flags to continue framing and blaming Al Qaeda and Muslims as scapegoats to fuel the war on terror, to keep it going and to keep the domestic police and surveillance state going here in the United States and in our also in the Western Allied countries. There was a 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center that was actually, we now know, run by the FBI informant Edmund Salem, who warned his handler that it was time to remove the real explosives and replace them by duds. And his handler said, no, let them stay. The explosives went off in the basement of World Trade Center 1 and killed 5 or 6 people and injured 1,000. And that was the dry run for 9/11. In the same building that was first hit on 9/11. 1998 African embassy bombings, they were actually run by a deep state US operative named Sergeant Ali Muhammad of the Army. The 2000 USS Cole attack in the harbor in Aden in Yemen was actually, there's strong evidence there was a bombing from inside the ship, not just the dinghy on the outside, which was a cover, just like the planes hitting the towers were a cover for their collapse on 9/11 in New York City. And the anthrax letter attacks. The government had absolute foreknowledge of the anthrax attacks, that actually there were many, many links, as you'll see in this presentation, of anthrax to the day of 9/11 itself, not just the official story of the government that wants you to believe that the only anthrax connection didn't happen and become known by anybody for a few weeks after the attacks on 9/11. That is a lie, as you will see. And I highly recommend 9/11 and False Flags webinar, the global webinar that was put on by No Lies Radio just not long ago. And there's a link on the screen when you get my PowerPoint slides to go watch that. You need to watch the whole thing. May I have the next slide, please? All right, so now we're back to that original slide. We're going to the next top signature of a false flag, and that's drills and exercises on scenarios like the actual attack that are run on the same day and time as the actual attack, but are, quote, taken live, unquote, by insiders. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, now, I don't know to the extent from my research that this has been proven, but it's certainly been claimed. All right, by someone who's was in a position to know. So key members of John F. Kennedy's Secret Service detail were told that there would be a test of his security in Dallas the next day in the form of a staged assassination that would not be allowed to succeed, and that would be blamed on pro-Castro Cubans for Cold War goals. And they were told, therefore, to stand down because it wasn't going to be a real hit. And therefore they did. Now, in the book, The Inheritance, which is a must read for every single person on the planet, in pages 102 to 103, there is this section on the staged alleged false flag assassination attempt that was taken live by the highest level insiders because they knew about the alleged drill and then made the drill become real world. So on page 102, 103, quote, so what turned the false flag, the so-called false flag alleged drill of an assassination attempt against JFK in Dallas on 9/11 into a real assassination? The author of the book, The Inheritance, Christopher Fulton, asked Secret Service agent Auk, who replied, Lyndon Johnson, Vice President Lyndon Johnson. So I think that there is pretty good reason to believe this. And interestingly, I highly recommend the book. I can't recommend it more highly. The book is called JFK-9/11, 50 Years of Deep State by French author Laurent Junot, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, that marshals the evidence that President Kennedy was in fact killed in a counter-assassination attempt, so-called exercise, that was taken live by Zionist agents, both inside the US and Israel, led by Vice President Johnson, who he claims and marshals the evidence was in fact a secret agent of Israel called a Cyan, and both of whose maternal great-grandparents were Jewish. All right, so if we can have the next slide, please. So this is the cover of this very, very important book. And when you get my PowerPoint slides, I'm not going to read the text on the left, but this is a must read book. And when you get my PowerPoint slides, you will see the link to purchase the book and also the ebook at the bottom of the slide. If I can have my next slide, please. Now we're going to the drills and exercises and war games that were happening. Most people don't know this, but this is an established, acknowledged fact by our government, not just on 9/11 itself, the day of 9/11 itself, but in the 5 or so days in the lead up to 9/11, beginning, I believe it was on even as early as September 6th, but for certain as early as September 8th of 2001. And what you're looking at here is a screen capture from one of the 9/11 Commission staff reports, graphics, charts, which lists these hijack scenario, taking over of a commercial airliner hijack scenario exercises that were going on by NORAD and our intelligence community in the week leading up to 9/11, including on 9/11 itself. An exercise was scheduled to start and actually did start in NORAD Northeast Sector called NEADS on the morning of 9/11 on a scenario very similar to the actual attacks of a commercial airliner crashing into the World Trade Center tower. If I may have the next slide, please. And of course, the real inside perpetrators, which could never have been Al-Qaeda, could never have been Osama bin Laden, could never have been Saddam Hussein. Insiders at the very top of the deep state who knew exactly what the so-called exercise was going to be, were able to then mimic the exercise, taking over the original planes, swapping them, and then remote controlling the second planes that were swapped into the targets on 9/11. All right, so this is the next slide on the next top signature of a false flag. No, and that is eyewitness accounts during and immediately after the attack do not, of course, match with the official account that is being amplified by the mainstream media. Okay, so here are some examples of those. Of course, these are just the tip of the iceberg because we have so many slides to cover. So these are just examples of the parallels of this critical signature of false flag attacks between the JFK assassination and September 11th mass assassination. All right, so of course, the lone shooter was in the, allegedly, by the official story, in the school book depository building versus massive numbers of bystanders knowing where the critical shot came from and rushing to the grassy knoll. That's, of course, just the tip of the iceberg. And it shows that Oswald could not have been the shooter of the headshot. And of course, we know he couldn't have been a shooter to begin with. So September 11th, the immediate government mainstream media line, of course, were that the towers collapsed solely due to the plane impacts and the fires. And in fact, top representatives, including General Barak of Israel and top neocon Israeli Zionims in the United States, just happened to be ready to go on mainstream television networks in both New York City. And while the towers were still smoking, said, well, there were no explosives involved. This was just plain impacts and fires. Well, how did they know, right? They were the insiders. Okay, so there were so here's the truth about 9/11. And just again, just the tip of the iceberg. There were multiple inside victim witnesses to explosions, believe it or not, in the deep basements of both towers. World Trade Center 1 and 2, before a plane hit either tower. Now that's a critical fact. Any kindergartner knows that it is impossible for a plane to have caused massive explosions 14 and 17 seconds before the planes hit either tower, dozens and dozens and dozens of floors above. The BBC actually live reported the alleged collapse of World Trade Center 7, 20 minutes before, a little bit over before it happened. People on the ground were saying that the World Trade Center plane, that was the second to hit the second World Trade Center tower, that wasn't a commercial airliner, that the plane was gray. In other words, it wasn't Flight 11, which of course means that the planes had to be swapped. And of course, President Bush and Condoleezza Rice, National Security Advisor, Vice President Cheney, they all said no one could have imagined using planes as weapons. Right. They were running military exercises in the week leading up to 9/11, including on 9/11 with NORAD fighter jets practicing the scenario of a plane crashing into the World Trade Center towers. May I have the next slide, please? And this is just another example with a Pentagon attack, the difference between the official story and the official lie and the truth. The right arrow is the alleged impact point of the Pentagon, which was almost at 9:38, according to the official story. They alleged that Flight 77 hit the building there. However, there was a massive, just like at the World Trade Center towers, there was a massive inside the Pentagon explosion. A massive inside the Pentagon explosion almost 8 minutes before that at the location of the left arrow at April Gallup's desk. She's a critical witness. And there are about 24 witnesses that she meets with who confirm that fact. And her wristwatch was stopped at exactly 9:30 by the massive explosion in her Army area. May I have the next slide, please? All right. So this is very important. I'm not going to read this whole slide, but I'm going to give you the gist of it. Again, this is the difference between the cover story lie that comes out immediately after the false flag event by the deep state and the truth. All right. So the author Christopher Fulton, in his book, The Inheritance, you learn that there was a JFK Oswald file in the Office of Naval Intelligence area of the Pentagon. And it was exactly that office, by the way, that was destroyed by pre-placed explosives, not a plane impact, on 9/11. And you can see that in my 9/11 documentary, Behind the Smoke Curtain, on YouTube. And later in this presentation, you will have, all you have to do is go to YouTube and plug in Behind the Smoke Curtain, Barbara Honegger, and you will see that. Also destroyed in the Pentagon attack on 9/11 was the Army area, where specially designated auditors were trying to track the $2.3 trillion that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and his top Pentagon financial officer, Dov Zakheim, had publicly announced were allegedly, quote, missing, unquote, the day before the attacks on September, excuse me, that should read 10th, not 12th. It should read September 10th. Gordon Ferry has reported to me that he was told that the 2.3 trillion in some way got to Israel, and that the 5 specially appointed auditors who were appointed by Dov Zakheim, who clearly knew too much, were taken to the Pentagon's courtyard and shot dead on 9/11. So you really do need to read this whole slide when you get my PowerPoint. Could we go to the next slide, please? So back to the 5 top signatures. The evidence, of course, conflicting with the official account is never mentioned by the mainstream media, or if it is ridiculed by the mainstream media and the government. Next slide, please. And of course, a perfect example of this, the big picture example is, to this very day, the US government and mainstream media still ridicule all serious JFK and 9/11 scholars as conspiracy theorists. Almost 60 years after the JFK assassination, the mainstream media is still pushing the official lie to the absurd extent, that on the 50th anniversary a few years ago, they didn't even mention the official congressional finding that it was in fact a conspiracy, that there was more than one shooter. And as of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, just this past September 11th, the mainstream media was still pushing the official lie that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda did it, despite bin Laden never having been on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list for the 9/11 attacks, and despite the fact that the FBI's own top investigative spokesperson, Rex Toom, publicly acknowledged, quote, "The FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11 and he has never been indicted for 9/11 and never was." The next slide, please. All right. And the next top signature of false flags, the official account of the event, is used to curtail rights and freedoms, in this case of the American people. The next slide, please. All right, this is very important for people to get. It's a really big picture fact. The 9/11 attacks killed about 3,000, a little bit under. The 9/11 lie has literally killed millions, and was used as the pretext for urgently passing extreme emergency powers and the curtailment of civil liberties, including the Patriot Act, the authorization for the use of military force passed by Congress on an emergency basis based upon what they were told happened on 9/11 that was a lie, and that was on September 14th, 2001. It also resulted almost immediately in the first ever it did result on 9/11 in the first ever activation of continuity of government. And also shortly after 9/11 on the establishment, many people don't know this, of the first ever United States military combatant command over the jurisdiction of the mainland United States called NORTHCOM. Also massive secret surveillance of US citizens' communication, including investigative journalists, activists, and defense attorneys, routine bodily searches of our bodies in airports, and even publicly lauded so-called authorized assassinations using drones of US citizens. And as you will see with Operation Coronavirus, the lessons learned from 9/11 have now been taken global. May I have the next slide, please? All right, this is, I'm not going to read this slide, but just again, false flags. Hitler's Reichstag attack was a false flag. They allowed the so-called communist agitator to plant his explosives in the Reichstag, and then planted their own to make sure it was a spectacular event. Arrested him, of course, blamed it on the communists, etc. Basically, George Bush Jr. Followed the same playbook almost exactly in the 9/11 attacks. Next slide, please. And this is just to remind you how the Bushes are, so close to the Nazis and to that mentality. And that this is Hitler and his New York banker, Prescott Bush Sr., who, if I recall correctly, was the grandfather of George W. Bush and the father of George Bush Sr. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide on these top signatures of false flags, and we're going to again parallel with the JFK assassination and 9/11. The conspirators and those compromised with foreknowledge. I remember Gordon Ferry mentioned that the head of the Shin Bet was brought in. The head of the Shin Bet was brought in to meet with James Jesus Angleton, who is the head of counterintelligence and basically an operative for Israel. He was an Israeli scion, and his first loyalty was to Israel. There's no question about that in my mind. They were told about the JFK assassination attempt as early as, I believe it was July 4th through the 14th of 1963 in meetings at CIA headquarters. So let's move to the next slide. And yeah, very good, thank you. So obviously the official reports in both cases, there's the Warren Commission official report and the official 9/11 Commission report. Everybody knows the Warren report was nothing but a bloody cover up and whitewash that was designed for the public in the world to believe that there was only one shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, and close the book, close the Warren Commission book forever, and they're still doing it. And on the right is the 9/11 Commission official report. And of course, David Ray Griffin, Professor David Ray Griffin, the Dean of the 9/11 Truth Movement, has referred to that in his 14 books on the truth about the 9/11 attacks. He's referred to the 9/11 Commission report as a 571-page lie. May I have the next slide, please? And of course, there's destroying and secreting of evidence that doesn't support the official lie, the official story, and the planting of evidence to support the official story. Obviously, with JFK, the feds, the FBI took over the investigation out of Texas, the destruction of the limo, the planting of the bullet on the gurney, 9/11, the FBI withheld the Pentagon videos, all of the, or most, not all, of the steel from the World Trade Center, which was forensic evidence, was carted off to China, et cetera, et cetera. May I have the next slide, please? Now, this is something that most people don't know. I believe that the inside perpetrators actually set up the official story, the official lie, as being so absurd that I have to believe that they intentionally want it to be discovered, that the real perpetrators want you to know that these claims that they make about what happened are physically impossible. And they want you to know that it's a lie, so that when you figure it out, they want you to feel powerless. The perfect examples I'm going to give, again, just the tip of the iceberg, but they're very well known, the magic bullet from JFK, and you're going to learn about the magic column in the 9/11 attacks. Next slide, please. So here's the magic bullet. Everybody knows about that. What you may not know is that DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Pentagon, has now come up with something called an extreme accuracy task ordnance round that is capable of changing course, changing trajectory after being fired from a sniper's rifle. I think Gordon should be paying attention to this. Once the shooter marks the target with a laser beam. Next slide, please. And here we have the magic column. All right, so that's World Trade Center 7 on 9/11. Many people still don't know, but I bet this audience does, that there was a third skyscraper in the World Trade Center complex on 9/11 that collapsed into its footprint for at least a third of its collapse in perfect gravity free fall collapse with no resistance whatsoever by any of its 80 columns. The official lie of this by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, is that, believe it or not, they claim that a single column, pretty high up in the building, column 79, just happened to get weakened enough that the entire building came down in its own footprint in a perfect controlled demolition, symmetrical collapse in 6 seconds. May I have the next slide, please? I'm not going to take the time to run this video clip. But when you get my PowerPoint slides, all you have to do is put the arrow over the screen for a second, and that will make the video bar visible under the screen. It's not visible until you do that. Then you click on the arrow in the video bar and you can run it. And this, of course, is the famous video of the collapse of World Trade Center 7 on 9/11 in only 6 seconds, which could only have happened by controlled demolition requiring pre-placed explosives and incendiaries to take out all 80 columns simultaneously, which has now been proven. Next slide, please. It has now been proven by a 4-year study by a team of structural engineers led by the chairman of the structural engineering department at the University of Alaska, Professor Leroy Halsey, did that study. and has proven that the only way with his computer simulation to reproduce the video of the actual collapse of World Trade Center 7 that everybody sees on TV, the only way to reproduce that video was to take out all 80 columns pretty far down in the building, I think between the 8th and the 14th stories. So we do know that that is what happened on 9/11. And of course, the government's official story is that it was the magic column that did it, just like the magic bullet in the JFK assassination. May I have the next slide, please? We're going to go past this slide to the next one. And I'm not going to run this because it would take another minute, and I don't want to run out of time, hopefully for quite a few more slides. But this is Cyril Wecht, and this is a video clip. If you get my PowerPoint slides again, you can start that video and you will be able to see Cyril Wecht looking at the evidence for the collapse of World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7 on 9/11 and saying that there must be a new investigation. Next slide, please. Okay, these are just some of the absurd official claims. I'm not going to read them, but the absurd official claims, I believe, are meant to be discovered by the people who set up the official cover story. But I'm not going to go into those. Next slide, please. All right, secret biowarfare links to both the JFK assassination and the 9/11 anthrax attacks. Why do I say anthrax-9/11 or 9/11-anthrax? Next slide, please. Well, the reason that I do is because, as you will see in a few slides further, it's the result of my own research that has gotten a lot of attention ever since I first published it in 2008. That's a long time, 13 years ago or so. I published my findings that there were massive connections of anthrax to the day of 9/11 itself, and in fact the lead up to 9/11, not just as the official lie would have you to believe after 9/11 by a couple of weeks. The government wants you to believe that the first anthrax wasn't mailed until exactly a week after 9/11 on September 18th, 2001, and that it didn't arrive and cause a problem in anybody's mailboxes for some time after that, when they just allegedly first learned about it, and that the first victim wasn't until October 5th. Okay, that's almost a month later. That is not true. And pretty soon you're going to see how you can learn that for yourself from my online lecture. So these are very, very important books. On the right, of course, is our own Judith Very Baker's new updated second edition of Lee Harvey Oswald and Me. And notice that and then Dr. Mary's Monkey. These are two very, very important books on the biowarfare, secret biowarfare research that was very critical to the truth about what Lee Harvey Oswald was doing, what Judith Very Baker was doing in the lead up to the JFK assassination, and of course the anthrax. In the anthrax letters that are directly linked to 9/11, including on the day of 9/11 itself, that anthrax is of course a biological weapon. And the anthrax in the anthrax letters were the highest, the greatest militarized anthrax ever known by the United States government, at 1 trillion spores per gram of weaponized powderized anthrax. That was a highly lethal and deadly bioweapon that was sent to both US Senators Daschle and Leahy, by the inside perpetrators in those anthrax letters as a warning to them to hurry up and pass the Patriot Act. They were the two senators, both Democratic senators, by the way, and they had been warned just before those anthrax letters were mailed by personal phone calls from both President Bush Jr. and Vice President Cheney to stop trying to delay the passage of the Patriot Act. And they were sent the anthrax letters. All right, next slide, please. Just a couple of other books, both by Judith Very Baker, Kennedy and Oswald, Big Picture, and David Ferry, that go into the biological warfare links, just like 9/11 with the anthrax, to the JFK assassination and to the 9/11 attacks. Next slide, please. All right. JFK actually warned us about what's happening now, 9/11, anthrax, and the COVID pandemic. This is a text of Kennedy's oration that was recorded on November 12th of 1963, only 10 days before he was killed. And this is from a tape that was in the possession of the author of the book Inheritance, Christopher Fulton. Quote, "In our great nation, there are those who want to achieve ultimate control over individuals, eliminate freedoms, and change the basic values that we as Americans hold truest in our hearts. This is inherently dangerous and cannot be sustained." Please go forward 2 slides to that one there. This is the link when you get my PowerPoint slides to my very recent podcast with the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, Richard Gage, architect Richard Gage. I did this with him, and you will learn all about the shocking links of anthrax to the day of 9/11 itself. I'll just give you the tip of the iceberg. And again, the link is back to the biowarfare links to the JFK assassination as well. And that was, of course, the fast-acting cancer that had been developed in an attempt, one of the many attempts by the CIA to try to assassinate Castro, to make it look like it was, an act of God, or just that he got cancer and suddenly died. So anyway, the tip of the iceberg of this is you will learn on this podcast, as well as my publications on this, my text publications. On the anthrax links leading up to, on the day of, as well as after 9/11 itself. You will learn that on 9/11 itself, not only was Vice President Cheney and his entire White House staff put on anti-anthrax Cipro on 9/11 itself, but President Bush and his White House staff and the military officers on board of President Bush's Air Force One plane flight back to Washington, D.C. from Offutt Air Force Base on 9/11 itself were all put on a week's regime of anti-anthrax Cipro. You have to ask yourself why. Next slide, please. When you get my slide presentation, you will have this link. I have put my entire detailed 100-page smoking anthrax timeline on the web. You need to read it all, and you need to be sitting down when you read it. Okay, now we're going to fast forward. The next slide, please. The next group of slides we're going to fast forward through because we're going to just skip, because you need to get my PowerPoint slides and read all of this. But you will also read all of this in my timeline that I just gave you the link, the extended anthrax attacks timeline. But these are critical screens from that timeline. I'm not going to go into it, but you do need to read them. The bottom line is that the United States military and intelligence community has been doing secret experiments on unwitting and innocent American Canadian civilians using biological and germ weapons literally for years, not just during the Cold War, but also after the Cold War. Okay, so give me a second. I'm going to let you know where to go. And by the way, I should let you know that anthrax was identified as one of the ideal biological weapons when it was aerosolized and powdered aerosolized anthrax with the right military ordnance delivery vehicle was identified during the Cold War, and it still is. One of the top bioweapons that could kill everything on the planet, not just human life, but all mammalian life on the planet. And that is literally a weapon of planicide, just like nuclear weapons. It's on the order of nuclear weapons. So now we're going to, give me a second, we're going to fast forward through all of these many slides. Okay, I need you to go to slide 60, if you would, please. All the way to slide 60. There we go. So all of this is not just history, it's happening now. Okay, can you go to the next slide? This will be the last slide on the anthrax, links to 9/11, and through the anthrax, it's a bioweapon that links to the work on the fast-acting cancer, which was directly linked to Lee Harvey Oswald being set up as the patsy. He knew too much for the JFK assassination. So at towards the very end of the anthrax timeline, the extended timeline, which you will have the link when you get these PowerPoint slides, you will learn this shocking fact. And that is that the United States government, through Dr. Fauci and others, are right now, as I'm speaking to you and have been for some time, genetically engineering a marriage or merger between anthrax and the coronavirus. And I want you to hear that. They are engineering the perfect biological weapon here in the United States. Here in the United States, merging anthrax and the coronavirus. So let's go to the next slide, please. As Daniel Ellsberg pointed out in this recent presentation, you have the link. I highly recommend that you watch his presentation. There are others, but I want you to watch his especially. He makes it clear that this kind of thinking that is capable of planicide, not just, to use a nuclear weapon on a city, but to literally be capable with something like weaponized anthrax with the right ordnance delivery vehicles or nuclear weapons can literally wipe out all life on the planet. Next slide, please. Let's pass that slide. All right. The British connection to the JFK assassination. As you heard Gordon Ferry say, this may have been just fronting for the US government, but I'm not certain of that. There was the revelation that was given to me that I've talked about twice, 2 years in these conferences, that Colonel Fletcher Prouty gave to me in Washington, D.C. in, I believe it was August of 1988. Fletcher Prouty attempted to recruit me into the British Secret Service. And that showed me that, in my opinion, his highest loyalty was to the British Crown. Now, in author Christopher Fulton's book, must-read book, The Inheritance, as Gordon Ferry also mentioned, this really stood out to me. The British royal family called the auctioneer house and said for JFK's wristwatch, said that they were willing to pay anything. It didn't matter how much for JFK's wristwatch that he was wearing when he was shot in the limousine, which we now know bears traces of mercury from the mercury bullet fired by files from the grassy knoll. So that's extremely important. And Fulton was later set up and raided by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And so there are all these links to certainly British MI6. There's no question in my mind with the JFK assassination. All right, and the next slide. Mercury rising, the smoking watch. You already heard about this from Gordon Ferry. And obviously, if Mercury is on the watch, JFK put his right hand up, when he was hit in the head from the front. And that's why there is Mercury on the watch from the mercury in the bullet. And that's why the entire deep state, especially the British Crown, the UK government, and the US government is willing to do anything to prevent that watch from being forensically analyzed. And that's the real reason I agree with Christopher Fulton and Gordon Ferry. That's the real reason JFK Jr., who had purchased the watch for $1 million from Christopher Fulton, the author of this book, that's the real reason that JFK Jr. was plane crash assassinated. And the question is, where is the watch today? I've read the book 3 times, and I don't believe that Christopher Fulton tells us where it is. Okay. If we can go to a couple more slides, and maybe one more slide. Let's see, next one. All right, finally, I think I'll probably end with this, and that is the Israeli connection to the JFK and the 9/11. The US neocons in Israel, there is no question in my mind whatsoever that they were the real perpetrators, the highest level perpetrators behind the 9/11 attacks. And I have to refer you to my documentary on 9/11 called Behind the Smoke Curtain on YouTube. Just plug in Behind the Smoke Curtain, Barbara Honegger, and you will you need to be sitting down when you watch this. About the last third, it's called Who Did It? And you will understand exactly who. I name the names of the Zionist network in both the United States at the highest levels of the Pentagon, our military intelligence community in the White House, as well as the Israeli government headed by Netanyahu, who wasn't actually prime minister at the time, but it's Netanyahu who was at the center of it on the Israeli side. So be sure and watch Behind the Smoke Curtain on YouTube, and an absolutely must read book, as I've mentioned before. It's by Lawrence Junot. It's called JFK 9/11, 50 Years of Deep State. And he will prove to you the Israeli connection to the JFK assassination and 9/11. All right, next slide, please. This is my Behind the Smoke Curtain. There's the link to it, but you don't need to write down the link because you will be able to just go to YouTube and plug in Behind the Smoke Curtain, Barbara Honegger, and it will come up. Next slide. This is again the same slide from before. This absolutely critical must-read book by Lawrence Junot, JFK 9/11, 50 Years of Deep State, on the Israeli connection to both JFK and 9/11. Next slide. Another absolutely critical book by Lawrence Junot, just out, June 21st of this year. You can obtain it through Abe Books, abebooks.com. There's the link where you can buy it. It's called The Unspoken Kennedy Truth. If you want a shorter version of the Israeli connection to both, not only mostly the Kennedy assassination, but also RFK assassination and some links to 9/11, that is a much shorter book. Next slide, please. FDR and JFK both resisted Zionist goals. FDR opposed dropping the atom bomb on Japan and opposed the establishment of the State of Israel. There is evidence he was assassinated. Colonel Fletcher Prouty down below gives you that evidence from one of his books. And Truman then became president and authorized the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atom bomb attacks and recognized the new State of Israel. All right, next slide, please. And I'm going to end with this section. I'll be very quick. And that is, I want people to understand the greatness of John F. Kennedy. I know that you already know this, but I'm going to give you what I believe is the greatest thing he did. And interestingly, he told his Secret Service agent, Bach, that's B-O-U-C-K. You learn about this in Christopher Fulton's book, The Inheritance. He told one of his Secret Service agents, he was very close to Agent Bach, that in fact, what I'm just going to give you in a nutshell here was the greatest thing, quote, the greatest thing I have ever done. And that was to protect the atmosphere of our precious planet Earth. Next slide, please. All right, these next few slides, which I'm going to go over, kind of gloss over, they're simply to show you, to prove to you that in the lead up to the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which FDR was not willing to do, he had to be killed in order to get Truman in place, who was willing to do it and did do it, did authorize General Groves of the Army to do it, who was in charge of the atom and H-bomb projects, the Manhattan Project on the military side. Oppenheimer was the top scientist on the scientific side of the Manhattan Project. And these slides will prove to you with quotes from the best historians that Truman was willing to go ahead with dropping these bombs, even though he was told that the H-bomb, that's not the A-bomb, but the H-bomb, which was coming next, that the H-bomb could ignite the entire atmosphere of the planet and the top level of the oceans of the planet, and yet went ahead and approved going forward with the entire program and dropping the bombs on Japan. Next slide, please. All right. In the summer of 1942, Edward Teller and Hans Bender warned Robert Oppenheimer. This is before the Alamogordo Trinity test of the first bomb test of the atom bomb. They, after intense mathematical calculations at Los Alamos National Laboratories, the birthplace of the Manhattan Project, they warned Oppenheimer that they could not rule out that the H-bomb would ignite the nitrogen in the entire atmosphere of the Earth and end all mammalian and other life on the surface of the Earth in the upper part of the atmosphere. Oppenheimer, when he heard that, opposed moving forward with the H-bomb, and because of it, lost his security clearance, and the H-bomb became a reality. All right, next slide. President Kennedy told his Secret Service agent Bach that the nuclear test ban treaty, which was a ban for all atmospheric testing to protect the atmosphere of the planet from precisely that, or any testing in the oceans, came from precisely that warning to both Oppenheimer and Truman. All right, I'm going to end my presentation there so that people understand the greatness of this man.
Thank you, Barbara Honegger.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, was that amazing? A little hot there, Bob. Okay, can you hear me now? Was that great or what?